Hey guys, we are in Unit 10 and this is day 2. This is called midpoint. So we have a warm-up first though. It says for each of the following, state the equation of the line with the given characteristics. In part A, it's talking about a slope of 0. And we have to remember that there's 4 types of slope: positive, negative, 0, and undefined. Slope of 0, hopefully you remember the little acronym there, HOY. This is used for horizontal lines because they have 0 slope and their equations are y equals a number. So because this is about 0 slope, we know that it's a horizontal line and it is, the equation is just y equals a number. All we have to do is find the number. And when they tell us a point that it passes through, for instance, it passes through 8, -5, 8 is the x coordinate in disguise and -5 is the y. And so that number is going to get replaced with -5 since y is -5. And so we are going to go ahead and say y equals -5. And there's the equation that would have a slope of 0 because it's horizontal, and it would pass through the point 8, -5. Okay. Part B. They are saying that it's parallel to the x-axis. So we have a graph over here so that we can see our x-axis. And in order to be parallel to the x-axis, it has to be going the same exact way as the x-axis. And the x-axis is a horizontal line. So our line parallel to the x-axis will also be a horizontal line. And so it will still be y equals a number. Okay? And because they're saying 1 unit above it, above would be a +1. And so we would say y equals +1. Okay? Part C. It says is perpendicular to the x-axis. Now, perpendicular to the x-axis goes the opposite way. So in this case, in order to be perpendicular to the x-axis, we have to make a right angle with the x-axis, and we have to be a vertical line. So we're going to think of VUX, V-U-X. V is for vertical lines. They have undefined slope, and their equations are x equals a number. And again, because it tells us the point it has to pass through, we know -2 is the x-coordinate and 3 is the y-coordinate. And because we said x equals a number, then our equation is going to be x equals -2. Okay. Part D. Part D says it's parallel to the y-axis. Well, the y-axis goes up and down, and so parallel to it would also be going up and down. And so we're still talking about vertical, so we're still talking about x equals a number for the equation of that line. And they said 10 units to the left of the y-axis. Well, 10 units to the left is going to put you on the negative side, and therefore we're going to be x equals -10. Okay. Last one, guys. It says it's perpendicular to the y-axis. So again, we have to find the y-axis. The y-axis is vertical, and if we're going to be perpendicular to it, we're going to have to make a right angle with a vertical line, and therefore we're going to have to be a horizontal line. And so we're going back to Hoy. And so we're going to be y equals a number. And because we're going to be 4.5 units below the x-axis, below would be negative. And so we are going to say our equation is y equals -4.5. And those equations are done. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about midpoint. There is a formula. It's pretty basic. We just have to remember that midpoint is a point, and all points have parentheses around their x coordinate and their y coordinate. And so remember that x coordinates come first. Okay? And so that's why they're adding the x's together first and dividing by 2. And then the y coordinate always comes second in a point. So that's why we're adding our y's together secondly and dividing by 2. Now, mid is middle. And when you think middle, think average. All right. When you average something, you add them together and you divide by how many things you added together. And so that's why in the formula, you're adding and dividing by 2. And so the little song goes, midpoint, midpoint. What do? You add them together and divide by 2. You just have to remember that you add the x's together, divide by 2, comma, add the y's together and divide by 2 and put parentheses around it like a point. Okay. A midpoint divides a line segment into what they call a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, when we have a line segment and we find the middle of it, we get an equal part here and an equal part here. So they say a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, so here we go, guys. Number 1, it says find the midpoint of a line segment whose endpoints are. So I have a line segment. One endpoint is at 6, -6, and I don't have a graph to graph it, and that's okay. I don't need one. All right, but just to give you a visual, what they're asking me to do is to find the coordinates of the point that's smack dab in the middle of 6, -6 and 12, -4. And so all we really have to do is follow the formula, and the formula says add them together and divide by 2. So first off, I get the structure of my formula down. Okay. So that's basically everything that stays the same. It's just different x's you're adding together in the first fraction, and then different y's you're adding together in the second one. So in the first one, I'm going to take my x's, which is 6 and 12, and add them together and divide by 2. And then I'm going to take my y's, which are -6 and -4, and we'll add them together and divide by 2. Okay, so in the first one, 6 plus 12 is 18, and 18 divided by 2 is 9. And -6 plus -4 is -10, and -10 divided by 2 is -5. And there's a coordinate of the midpoint, or the point that lies exactly right in between 6, -6 and 12, -4 on a graph. And if you really think about it, take a look. Doesn't 9 fall smack dab in between 6 and 12? It's actually 3 from each. Okay? And -5 lies smack dab in between -6 and -4. It's -5 is 1 away from each one of those. And that's why that midpoint formula is nice. Okay, it gives us the coordinates of the point right in the middle. All right, so let's try another one. So in this one, we have 7, -2, and -1, 9. And midpoint, what do? Add them together and divide by 2. We just have to remember x's go first. So 7 and -1 will be my x's that are being added together. And then -2 and 9 are my y's being added together. Okay? So 7 plus a -1 is 6, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. -2 plus 9 is 7, and 7 divided by 2 is 3.5. And there's the coordinates of my midpoint. All right, let's take a look at number 2. It says if the endpoints of a diameter are A, 2B, and 3A and 4B. So what happens is that instead of giving me, exact coordinates on a graph, they gave me some variable coordinates. No big deal. We can do the same exact thing with them in the midpoint formula that we can do with numbers. They want to know the coordinates of the center of the circle. And so this one, we have to just talk about the circle, but they're talking about the endpoints of a diameter. And we just got done with talking a bunch about circles in our volume unit. And we have to know that the center of the circle is actually the midpoint of the diameter line segment. And so because they want the coordinates of the center, they're really asking for the coordinates of the midpoint of these two endpoints of our diameter. So no different. Midpoint, what do? Add them together and divide by 2. All right, so we're going to take our x coordinates first, which are A and 3A, and add them together and divide by 2. And then we'll take our y coordinates of 2B and 4B and add them together and divide by 2. Okay, so a little algebra here. A plus 3A is 4A. They're like terms, they go together. And 4A divided by 2 is 2A. Likewise, 2B plus 4B is 6B, and 6B divided by 2 is 3B. And there is the coordinates of the midpoint, aka the center of the circle. Okay. Number 3 is a little bit differently, and you guys can see why in a second. But it says if M is the midpoint of AB, find the coordinates of point B. So they're not asking for the midpoint. They're actually giving us the midpoint. All right, so it says if M is the midpoint of AB, and notice they're giving us M. So we're not looking for the midpoint in this question. So this is almost what I would call a work backwards one. So what they are giving me is they're giving me coordinates of A, which is at 5, -1. They're giving me the coordinates of M, which is the midpoint at -1, 1. And they're asking for the coordinates of B all the way down here. Okay, so we're not going to use the midpoint formula. We could, but I think that it's more difficult. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to just look at this. Okay, if you think back to our very first one, okay, you had to add 3 to get from 6 to 9, and then you had to add 3 to get from 9 to 12. Well, we're going to figure that out with ours. So we're going to say, all right, how do I get from 5 to -1? Obviously, you have to subtract something, and you're going to have to subtract 6. 5 minus 6 is -1, right? So if that's a midpoint, then it's going to take the same amount of units to add or subtract to get to your other endpoint. And so if we are at -1 and we subtract 6, then we're going to be at -7. And now we know our x coordinate. Okay. Likewise, we're going to do the same thing for the y's. Okay. -1 to 1. In order to get from -1 to 1 on a number line, you have to add 2 units to it. And so because that's a midpoint, we're going to still have to add 2 to get to the other endpoint. And so 1 plus 2 is going to give us a coordinate of 3. And there's our midpoint, -7, 3. Okay, so we're going to do it one more time. So for these work backwards ones, I always draw a picture. So A is at -3, 3. M, which is your midpoint, is at 1, -10. And they're looking for the coordinates of B with the other endpoint. Okay. And so if we go ahead and take a look at our x's, we're at -3, and we have to figure out how to get to 1. On the number line, -3 to 1 is adding 4. So I'm going to go ahead and add 4 again, and I end up at 5. And now I know the x coordinate. Okay. The y's, I got to get and figure out how to get from 3 to -10 on the number line. So if I'm at 3 and I have to get to -10, I'm going to have to be subtracting, and I'll have to be subtracting 13. Therefore, I have to subtract 13 from -10, and I end up with -23. And there's the coordinates of the endpoint. Okay. All right, guys, I'll see you on the backside for a little bit more practice.